Our bodies are made of stardust, and our souls are made of stories. I don't know who said that, but I like it. I think there's something profound there, yeah? Certainly the stardust part, right? We're told that at the time of the Big Bang, there was lots of hydrogen, quite a bit of helium, a little bit of lithium. But of course, there's lots of heavier elements in our bodies, and those were actually fused in the cores of stars that later exploded. And get this, if it's true, the heaviest of all elements, beginning with gold, they actually had to be fused in the cores of supernovas that then exploded. So our solar system is like a secondary formation as a result of that. And it's kind of incorporated into our bodies. Our souls are made of stories. We don't usually talk about souls in Buddhism, but maybe we can say ourselves, or better, our sense of self. Is that made of stories? The American poet Muriel Rukeyser said, "The world is made of stories, not atoms." But can we say that atoms is one of our important stories? The point is that we humans are not just animals that use language, that stories are essential to who we are. We are storytelling creatures. And that refers not only to narratives, the stories we tell each other, but the whole way that we understand the world. Stories aren't just narratives, they're explanations, accounts of something. More than just stories, they are how we make sense of the world. There's no other way to do that. We don't experience the world and afterwards make up stories to understand it. Stories teach us what's real, what's true, and how to live in it, including what's possible. So stories can't be simply dismissed as kind of abstractions, although they can be that, but they are necessary for our engagement with life. As the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre said, "I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the question of what story or stories do I find myself a part?" What does it mean to be a person, a man or a woman? Straight or gay or transsexual or American or Chinese or a person of color or white? Stories tell us that. From a Zen perspective, maybe the most important question is, how much do we use stories, and how much do the stories use us? How much do we get trapped in the stories? There are different layers of story. We're already storying the world when we experience as a collection of separate things, including you and me, that interact and use various things in the world. This connects with the point that I want to emphasize. And I think it's clearer in Zen than in a lot of other Buddhist traditions or other spiritual traditions, that the point is not to transcend this world, We don't understand this world as samsara, inherently problematic, and the idea is not to be reborn into it. We don't understand it in that literal sense. But we can transcend the world. We need to transcend the world by transcending, by understanding our usual ways that we story the world and how we get stuck in those, and how we can transcend the world by changing our stories. According to Buddhist teachings, we could say that the way we normally experience the world is a social and psychological construct that can be deconstructed and reconstructed, which is one way to understand what we're doing when we're doing Zazen, so that we can experience it, including ourselves in it, differently. The problem, of course, is that we're unaware, normally, that our stories are stories. We see through them. We see them as the world. Like fish that don't see the water they swim in, we take them for granted. We don't notice the medium that we're dwelling within. We think that the world is just the way things are, but in Buddhist practices, we know, we learn to say, don't believe everything you think. Stories are constructs that can be reconstructed, but they're not free-floating, right? We co-create the world that we live in with stories. We need stories to account for climate change and enable us to address it. Not just climate change, but we could say the ecological crisis generally. We can't simply unstory global warming, climate change. Although some fossil fuel corporations have tried to do that with some success, right? If they can persuade people that our concern about the climate crisis is just a kind of a necessary story. The most important term in early Buddhism certainly is dukkha, the word that we usually translate as suffering. But we need to understand it in the broadest sense, not just physical, mental pain, but frustration, dissatisfaction, anxiety, dis-ease. The Buddha emphasized that all he had to teach was dukkha and how to end it. If we understand that using story language, we can say that accepting or identifying with certain stories and trying to live according to them, because they teach us our roles, right? That a lot of the typical types of stories, especially stories involving the self, involve dukkha, create dukkha, capture us in dukkha, right? And changing the stories can reduce that dukkha. The central character in the foundational story that we keep returning to over and over again is, what else? The self. Supposedly individual and real, and yet composed of or constructed by the stories I identify with and attempt to live. As Alistair MacIntyre implied, stories give my life the plot that makes it meaningful. For example, for lots of people, it's important to have lots of money, right? I think that's a classic, or kind of consumerism we tend to get caught up with here. Acting out our story has consequences, which in Buddhism is called karma. Different stories that we identify with and we try to live out, they have different types of consequences, which creates karma. From this perspective, karma isn't something that the self has. It's what the sense of self becomes as it gets entrenched in its roles. Habitual tendencies congeal into our personality and character, and we end up bound without a rope, believing that the story is a reflection or a description of the real external reality, and not realizing that we have accepted, co-constructed a story that we're then trying to live according to, and that's what creates the problems. According to the psychologist Guy Claxton, consciousness is, quote, a mechanism for constructing dubious stories whose purpose is to defend a superfluous and inaccurate sense of self. The main plot of these stories tends to revolve around fear and anxiety, because the central character, the constructed character, the I, being a construct, can never achieve the security or the stability or the groundedness that it seeks. These kinds of stories attempt to secure and aggrandize an ego self, understood to be separate from the rest of the world. And according to Buddhism, that sense of separation is a delusion. And therefore, grounding, securing a sense of self, that kind of self cannot be secured. Sometimes I talk about this in terms of sense of lack. That because the sense of self is a psychological and social construct, right? Babies aren't born with this sense of self. It's something that develops as we identify with the stories. In modern language, it's a construct, and therefore, being a construct, the sense of self has no inherent separate reality. And we experience that as a sense of lack. The feeling that something is wrong with us, something is missing, something isn't quite right. I'm not good enough. Anybody ever experienced anything like that before? So I talk about lack projects, that we tend to get caught up in certain types of, caught up in the sense of really obsessed. We don't really consciously normally know what's going on, but we're basically trying to secure ourselves or fill up the sense of lack or make ourselves feel more real by getting enough of something out here. If only I had enough money or consumer toys, if only I were famous enough or powerful enough, or my partner were perfect enough, or something like that, then everything would be okay. But since all of those preoccupations are just symptoms of the fundamental problem, they can never work, right? If our lack project is getting enough money to fill up our sense of lack so we feel whole and complete, we can never have enough money. We can never be famous enough. We can never be powerful enough. If we try to express some of this in terms of stories, we can say, on the Buddhist path, awakening, realizing, involves understanding that whatever story I've been trying to live out is part of some larger story. or a web of stories that incorporate other stories as well. Our stories don't have sharp edges. They're interdependent. They're composed of lots of other stories, recombined and internalized. And we grow up by accepting the stories that society tells us, reinforcing them by acting in ways that validate them. Stories teach us what it means to be a person, as I said earlier, what it means to be a boy or a girl, American or Chinese, and so forth. There's an important difference between what we might call sort of improving our karma and realizing how karma works. And this too can be expressed in terms of stories. There are different types of freedom that can develop on this path. One type of freedom is the freedom to act out our story, the stories we identify with. And that's often that hasn't been the case. People have been very limited in terms of, certain types of totalitarian societies. They tell you what the story is and you don't have much choice. Yeah. Another kind of freedom is the freedom to change our stories, the stories that we try to live out. I used to live in Singapore, and right across the straits there in Malaysia, if you were born a Malay Malaysian, there's Chinese as well, but if you're a Malay, actually you're not allowed to be anything but Muslim. You're not allowed to convert to any other religion. You're not allowed to change your story. But a third sense of freedom, a third type of freedom, results from understanding how storying works, how my stories construct and constrict my possibilities. And in a way, this could be understood as a kind of freeing from karma. So from a Buddhist perspective, I think here's the question, and it's an important one. On this path is the point to find the true story, especially in earlier Buddhism, right? We have, 4 Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, 5 skandhas, or interdependence, karma, rebirth. Is it to find the true story? And then live according to that? Is that what the Buddhist path is about? Or is it more about getting rid of stories? And that's one way to understand what we're doing when we're meditating, right? That when we're meditating, we learn, thoughts come into mind, and we learn not to stick to them, not to let the one thought lead to another thought, but to let it come and go naturally. But it's still an odd story, the story that the goal is to get rid of all stories. Remembering what was said earlier about, how do we know how to live until we know what our story is? Is it really to get rid of all stories, or is it maybe this third possibility? Can we understand how storying works? And even though we need stories, to hold the stories in a lighter way, not being so identified with them, not being so stuck in them. Understanding we need them, but understanding that they're not outside trapping us. Does this make any sense? Dogen, somewhere in the Shobogenzo, says something like, on this path, the point isn't to get rid of concepts, but to liberate concepts. And in a way, we could understand storying in that sense. Yeah. It's a funny way to sort of put it, not to get rid of ideas and concepts, but to understand them better so that we're not trapped by them. The stories that make sense of this world are part of this world. As I said before, it's not, therefore, that we need to transcend physically, as it's so often been said, that we need to transcend. We understand samsara as this world, and the idea is to go to some other higher reality. But rather, we transcend our usual way of understanding and experiencing by seeing through the stories that we have been trapped in. In other words, changing the metaphors. Joseph Campbell said, if you want to change the world, you have to change the metaphor. We could say, change the stories. He also said, every religion is true one way or another when it's understood metaphorically, but when it gets stuck in its own metaphors, interpreting them as facts, then you're in trouble. And there's even a better version of that by a New Testament scholar, John Dominic Crossan, who said, my point is not that those ancient people told literal stories, and we're now smart enough to take them symbolically, but that they understood them, they used them, told them symbolically, and we are now dumb enough to take them literally. Wow. The metaphorical nature of all religious language means that its assertions are difficult to evaluate, but this is, I think, helping us point in that direction. Myth. Myth, like metaphor, generally avoids the problem by being meaningful in a different way. It's not about, with myth, it's not about offering us propositions like philosophical statements that we're told we have to accept. Myths work differently. They give us stories that we can interact with. For example, my favorite story of all, maybe I'm not the only one, is the story of the Buddha's life, right? I mean, we all know, according to that story, right? Raised in a very protected way, didn't know anything about old age, illness, and death until his charioteer took him into the town. And he realized, oh, that's going to be me too, and that realization sent him on its way. The reality is, as Buddhist scholars emphasize, we don't know how much, if any, of that story is literally true. Nothing was written down for like 300 to 400 years. It may all be myth. But you know the wonderful thing about that myth? It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if it actually happened that way. It's this incredible myth that still has so much meaning existentially, whether it literally happened or not. I'm reminded of the Jewish rabbi who said, all my stories are true. Some of them happened and some of them didn't. But they're all true. True in the most important sense, right? So that story about the Buddha, that is one of the truest stories, yeah? Even though we have no idea if it ever happened that way. Maybe the way to evaluate a myth is by what happens when we try to live according to it. Maybe that's the way to look at it. And we could say then for Buddhism, the most important criterion is, does it reduce dukkha or not? A story about the suffering of old age, illness, and death challenges these stories with which we normally become preoccupied and kind of like to ignore our mortality, right? Stories about money, for example, or consumerism, possessions, fame, power, and how letting go of those preoccupations can open up other possibilities. Different stories, and perhaps a different way of relating to stories. So myths, from this point of view, are not false stories, bad stories, that need to be replaced with rational or scientific accounts that more accurately grasp the empirical world. Maybe the most dangerous myth from a story perspective, maybe the most dangerous myth is the myth of a life without myths. The story of a realist who has freed himself or herself from all that nonsense. The story that science and sort of reason can liberate us from the supposed unreason of myth. Is that one of our popular fictions today? Does this make any sense? Yeah? You said that I would be pretty much talking a little bit about eco-dharma, so let's move in that direction a little bit. Start in that direction anyway. The role of stories in societies. For example, think of how certain stories justify social distinctions. Medieval kings ruled by divine right. A Rig Veda myth about the various parts of Brahma's body rationalizes the Hindu caste system, which of course the Buddha challenged. We challenge a social arrangement by questioning the story that is used to rationalize or validate it. When people stop believing the stories that justify that social order, then that order begins to change, right? Think of the French Revolution. When the French people no longer accepted the divine right of their king, that was the beginning of the end for the French Revolution. Today, one of the most common stories is the story of a universe reducible solely to sort of impersonal physical laws which are totally indifferent to us and to our fate. Human beings serve no function in the grand schema of things. We have no significant role to play except perhaps to enjoy ourselves, if we can, as much as we can, for as long as we can. That's a story. This story has social applications as well. Think of evolution. Very soon after Darwin talked about natural evolution, without God supervising it, right? Natural selection. Very soon after Darwin, you got Herbert Spencer, this British philosopher who sort of applied Darwin's story to the social order and created what was called social Darwinism, right? Appropriating Darwin to justify the evolution of a new kind of industrial society or economy. According to that story, just as evolution involves a lot of competition, so in the modern world, you've got to crawl over the next guy to get to the top, or he or she will crawl over you. The value and meaning of life are largely understood in terms of survival, success, competition, the measure of which was, for him, of course, largely financial. according to that story, life is about what you can get and what you can get away with until you die. You're either a winner or a loser, and if you aren't successful, well, don't blame anybody else. Social scientists have sort of discredited that story, but I think it's still pretty widespread. In fact, I can even think of a recent political figure, should I say president, who probably leaves something like that, he who must not be named. By no coincidence, of course, Spencer's social Darwinism appealed most of all to powerful industrial tycoons like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller, in a Sunday school address, get this, in a Sunday school talk, justified his business principles by comparing them with cultivating a rose. And when you're growing roses, you have to pluck off a lot of the little buds to make the one big blossom really beautiful. That beautiful rose, quote, can be produced in the splendor and fragrance which bring cheer to its beholder only by sacrificing the other buds which grew up around it. This isn't evil. It's merely the working out of a law of nature and a law of God. It's not clear from this story whether the little rosebuds that are plucked off, I don't know, are they his competitors or his own employees? But I think we know what he meant by the big, beautiful rose, right? So obviously this basic tenet of social Darwinism, and again, story, is still very much with us today. For example, Ayn Rand, whom, by the way, several of our presidents and a number of Supreme Court justices have been kind of disciples, followers of Ayn Rand, and that's really a kind of modern version of this. And how wonderfully this story ends up rationalizing the kind of economic system we have. From a Buddhist perspective, however, that story is not only diluted, but it rationalizes some very unsavory tendencies, including the three poisons of greed, aggression, and delusion. It's a story founded on the belief that each of us is ultimately separate from each other, that therefore rationalizes the pursuit of my own well-being, indifferent or even at the cost of your and other people's well-being. Indifferent to what's happening to others. Today, sociologists point out that a social application of social Darwinism really kind of confuses the principles that Darwin was talking about from the way that we can come together to reorganize society. Society isn't just an unthinking, natural product of evolutionary processes. It's something that we can control. We can, if we're not happy with the way it's working, we can reconstruct it. And so often we go back, when we think about the origins of Western tradition, we go back what? We go to Greece. Because it was, say, at the people of Athens that realized, right? They got into a particular kind of pickle, and so they decided they could reconstruct. They could create something called democracy, a new story about how they might govern themselves. They realized they could create a new story. The problem is, when we accept something like social Darwinism and act according to it, it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. We socially construct the world. If we think in social Darwinist terms, then the world becomes that way, you see. If we accept what Spencer is saying that the world is simply this competition, and you've got to do whatever you have to crawl over the next person to get to the top. If we all accept that story, guess what? Yes, that's the world we end up with. But what if we don't accept that story? What if we can find different types of stories? What if we can realize that story doesn't work in the sense that it doesn't really make many people happy? Maybe it doesn't even make the billionaires happy. In the United States right now, it's said that 3 people have more wealth. I think the 3 people are what? Amazon, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Elon Musk. I don't know. Anyway, we all know the names. Those 3 people have more wealth than the bottom half of the US population. And the statistic that really shocked me when I came across it recently, those who came last night already heard it, that right now in the world as a whole, about 1% of the wealthiest people basically own about 50% of the world's wealth. And from the other side, the 50% of the poorest people, almost 4 billion people now, own only about 1% of the world's wealth. I mean, why do we accept that? Is it because we're accepting a story about free enterprise and the way that things will naturally go? Well, if it's natural, the implication seems to be that we should just accept it, right? If that's the way capitalism works. But can we understand capitalism as based on a particular kind of story? And we can change that. It's how a social Darwinist type story can be normalized, or normalize such a disparity, with the implication that it should be accepted because it's not just a story, it's describing reality. So again, I guess what I'm trying to point to here is how so much of what is often taken about as reality is a story. And I think how much of our Buddhist practice is becoming aware of the stories that we individually and we as a society tend to unconsciously accept, and becoming more aware of them, and becoming aware that we can change our stories, leading to different types of karma, different types of consequences, both individually and collectively. Instead of accepting such a story which rationalizes the growing power and wealth of this privileged elite, we can look for better stories, better because of living, better in the sense that if we live according to them, then they would be reducing dukkha, suffering, to a great degree. And also they would enable us to do a better job of addressing the ecological crisis. Collectively as well as personally, our stories can change. And in this case, I think we can see that they must change so that we can respond better to the kinds of challenges that we're facing now. Noam Chomsky a couple years ago said this is the most dangerous moment in human history. And he pointed to certain things, but one of the aspects that makes it so dangerous is are we in a kind of chaos of stories, that there's so many more stories flying around? I remember, revealing my age, I remember when I grew up, the story that we pretty much took for granted, despite the Cold War, was the story of progress. Right? The world was getting better, or the world would get better. Just post-war, this extraordinary explosion in the economy, right? Things were going to get better. It must be so hard to be a teenager now because it's so hard to believe in that story. And then the question is, what other stories might one have? So in this pluralistic world, the foundational narratives, the foundational stories that served us in the path, both past, both religious and secular, they're no longer accepted in the same way. It's like one of the dimensions, one of the main ways that this huge struggle going on right now is in terms of stories, in terms of the way stories are taught us. Okay, think of Fox News. I was trying to think of a way without mentioning them specifically, but the role of promulgating certain types of stories. And if you think so much about the tensions between Democrats and Republicans, you can look at it in a lot of ways, but so much of it comes down to very different stories. And stories that are taken for granted as reality and unbudgeable. And once you've got the right story, once you've really got the right story, you don't have to worry about talking to somebody else to discuss. You've got the right story. You've got it. So Gary Snyder, the Zen poet, he also talked about stories. This is my way of coming to a conclusion. Gary also said that the world is made of stories. But he went on to say, good stories are hard to come by. And a good story you can honestly call your own is an incredible gift. And I think those of us who are here today, having this center, having this path, we're fortunate to have this wonderful story about how to live, how to develop, what story to practice by, what story to live according to, right? These stories, he says, he continues, are part of a bigger story that connects us all. Wonderful. So may we practice here and elsewhere. May we practice in a way that we become more and more aware of the stories that we are living by. Not to get rid of stories altogether, but to realize, to hold lightly a certain type of story about how we might live, how we might relate to each other. More awareness of the social stories we've internalized so that we don't automatically identify with them. To choose the stories and roles we want. The ones that the stories that tend to reduce suffering and lead to increased wisdom and compassion. I've kind of talked around all this, but what can I say? I hope you have enjoyed my story this evening. Thank you.